Now that we've gone over the sound design order of operations, let's start by making a patch from scratch. And the type of patch we're going to make first is a pad. So that is the pad that we're going to create from scratch in this video. Let's get started. A pad is traditionally used to fill out the sound in a nice, pleasant, full way. It usually has a very smooth, full tone to it, and when you press it, it usually takes a few seconds for it to ramp up to full volume. At the same time, when you release the keys, it usually takes a few seconds for the sound to fade out. So let's take a look at how we're going to create a pad from scratch. We'll pull up Anna 2 and load the init patch. Take a listen to this init patch here. And following our order of operations, the first thing we're going to do is look to our amp envelope. Now, like we said, a pad is typically going to have a pretty slow attack and a pretty long release. And then we'll also take down the decay and sustain a little bit so that once it reaches full volume, it comes back just a few dB down with the sustain. Let's take a listen to this amp envelope and make sure that we like it. So after some tweaking there, we like the sound of this amp envelope. Let's move on to the next stage of our sound design process, and that is to look at the oscillators. Now this pad that we're creating, we're going to create a pretty analog sounding pad. So we're going to focus more on these three wavetable oscillators. So let's load up with our first wavetable oscillator here. We're going to go into the DLC folder, which is where all of these Slate Digital custom wavetables live. And let's go to the Slate Analog folder and try a few out. So we landed on this ARP triangle. I really like the sound of this. It's a very pleasant, softer tone to it. So we're going to start with this as the fundamental of our sound. I'll tuck back the volume just a little bit, and I'm going to add some voices to this sound. Now the voices are going to thicken the sound and make it more wide sounding. Now in order to unify these voices a little bit more, I'm going to turn the detune knob down. This is going to lessen the amount of detune between each voice, and it's just going to tighten up the sound a little bit. So I like that for oscillator 1. Let's flip over to oscillator 2, and this time let's look in the 3D Slate Digital folder. And what we're going to look for here is something that's going to add a little bit more of a high frequency grit to our sound. Let's try a few out. So I really like this flanger talk wavetable. It's got a really nice sound to it, and it's a lot more aggressive than the first oscillator that we loaded up. But since we have it turned down with the volume a bit, we're getting a nice blend between the two, and the overall sound is still pretty mellow and still pretty pad-like. So we'll experiment with the voices and the volume, and we'll also experiment with the sub. I always like to try these things out. Since we're going for a nice big full sound for this pad, let's load up another wavetable in oscillator 3. And with this oscillator, I'm looking to fill out the low frequencies a bit more. That's how we're going to get a nice full sound. So let's go into the Slate analog folder again, and let's load up this ARP sine. So we'll give it some voices, we'll balance out the volume a bit, and I've also taken the octave down 1 octave, and that's how we're going to get this nice full low frequency sound here. Just using this ARP sine wave down 1 octave. You can see how it's much fuller sounding now. Take a listen. Alright, so we've got our oscillators, very happy with how those are sounding and how they're blending together. Let's now move on to the next step in our order of operations for sound design, which is to look at the filter section. So with this pad, we're going to load up a low pass filter in order to get a little bit more control over the high frequencies. We'll adjust the cutoffs here in order to start hearing this low pass filter. And then I'm going to use the filter envelope in order to shape how this filter sounds. And I'm going to set the attack a little bit longer than the attack for the amp envelope. And this is going to allow us to hear that filter opening up very slightly, but it's going to give us some nice movement to our pad. Take a listen. So you can hear there that filter is sounding really nice now. Let's move on to the next step in our order of operations for sound design, which is the effects. The first thing I'm going to do is turn on the delay and reverb sends. We can hear this is going to widen up the sound a good bit. Then I'm going to look over to insert 1 and let's load up the multi-limiter. And we're just going to use this ever so slightly to shape our sound and tighten up the spectrum a bit. So you can see how the highs and the lows, I'm pulling those triangles down a little bit. It's really going to crunch those a little bit more, and it's going to give us a little bit more of a scooped sound. Let's also try out something in insert 2, something with a little bit more modulation, maybe a chorus or an ensemble. So we landed on this chorus. I really like that sound. Now, as I'm going through this process, I'm also going back and listening to the blend of the oscillators. And I might want to rebalance things just a little bit to make sure that we're keeping our levels in check and also just making sure that the sound is going in the direction that we want it to. So I'll pull up the oscillator mixer just to go back and tweak a little bit. Alright, so that's a good blend with the oscillators. Now let's move on to the next stage in the process, which is adding any additional modulation to our sound. And what I want to do with this sound is add just a little bit of a pitch scoop up as notes are being played. I want the pitch to slide up to the final pitch very subtly in order to add a little bit of a movement to the attack of this pad. So I'm going to use the G envelope to do this. And I'll start by drawing the type of curve that I want to see. And then I'll attach the target to the pitch fine all. I just want a very subtle scoop of pitch, nothing too drastic. And I'll just play around with the rate and the depth Also make sure I turn on retrigger so that it happens at the beginning of each note that I press. And I'll just play around until this feels right. So that's a good sound there. I like how that pitch is now scooping up. Let's take a look at the next step of our process, which is the macros. We're going to set up our macros now. And this is where we get to make our patch really playable. I usually like to add a cutoff macro as the first macro. It's always nice to have control over that so that you can fit the patch into the track that you're working on. So we'll simply right-click on our cutoff knob and we'll assign it to macro 1. So now macro 1 is controlling our cutoff. Let's look at macro 2. Now with macro 2, I want to add some more flexibility to this patch. So I'm going to look up to one of the oscillators here. Let's look up oscillator 2, and let's play around with the sync knob of this oscillator. This is going to make this patch really dynamic if we're able to control this sync knob with a macro. It's almost like we're adding some harmonics to the sound. So I'll call this macro Harmonics. Let's move on to the next macro, which we're going to make a modulation effect here. So let's call this one Chorus. And we'll set it to the dry wet of the chorus effect. Tweak it a little bit to just make sure that this chorus effect sits right. Now let's move on to macro 4. And macro 4, we're going to call this the space macro. This is how we're going to add our space. So we're going to tie the dry wet of the reverb and the dry wet of the delay to this macro. So now when we turn this macro up, we're turning up the delay and reverb, which is giving us that nice big space. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm noticing that the reverb isn't as extreme as it could be when we turn this macro all the way up. So I'm going to turn up the dry amount into the reverb send in order to add a little bit more reverb to this sound. So that's good for the macros. Now, we also get to assign our mod wheel because we want this mod wheel to really drastically control the sound. So we're going to actually tie this to oscillator 1 sync knob to add even more high frequency harmonics here to our sound. So we're going to right click on the oscillator 1 sync knob and tie it to the mod wheel. So now every time I use the mod wheel on my MIDI controller, I'm going to be adding even more high frequency harmonics. Now, I don't necessarily want to go all the way to maximum value on this sync knob, so I'll go into the macro matrix here, and I will simply pull back the amount that the mod wheel is going to control oscillator 1's sync knob. Set that to about 50, that feels good. So that means when I turn the mod wheel all the way up, it's only going to turn the sync knob of oscillator 1 up 50%, which feels good for this patch. So now we'll make any final tweaks that we have. I usually like to look at the EQ at this point. And so now we've got a great sounding patch. I love the way this pad feels. It's really nice and full and pleasant sounding, which is exactly what a pad should be. Let's move on to the final step of our sound design process, which is to tag and save our preset. For some reason, this pad sounds a little bit like an organ to me, so we're going to call this one All the Stops, because when you play an organ, if you turn on all the stops, you're going to get all these nice high-frequency harmonics, which is what we're getting when we turn up the mod wheel and when we use our harmonics knob on our macros. We'll make sure we set good tags and categories. And we'll save it. So that is one way in which you can create a pad, and we did it by following our order of operations of sound design. Create a few unique sounding pads on your own and go through this sound design process in order to create those pads. This course is available in the Slate Digital All Access Pass, which gives you thousands of dollars worth of award-winning plugins, the industry's most game-changing synthesizer, Anna 2, and the very best masterclass production courses taught by the industry's biggest pros, all for $14.99 per month.